So welcome human leaders to another live human leaders session. This evening we have a really exciting session on our hands. We're actually hosting a mastermind, which is something that we don't always do at Human Leaders very often, but we felt that with the topic and the incredible data that we have to explore this evening, it was best to host the session in this way. So this evening's session, we're joined by Dr. John Chan and also Sally Clark, who you may have met through Human Leaders before. Now, we've got these two incredible co-authors and co-researchers with us this evening to talk about the preliminary data that they have found in the global burnout study of 2022. Now, this study is in its third consecutive year. The team is doing a longitudinal study here so that they've got those comparative results over that time frame. And this year, they are currently in the data analysis phase and just pulling their report together. So the reason today's session is so exciting is because this report hasn't actually been published yet. So we're getting an exclusive first look and first conversation with researchers really at the forefront of this burnout research. So it's a very, very exciting time for us. And we are, of course, feeling very privileged at Human Leaders to have them both with us to share this. So just before I dive in, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. John Chan, who is the Managing Director at Infinite Potential, which is a non-profit think tank focused on workplace research. So he's an industrial organizational psychologist with over 20 years of global experience designing people strategies that actually transform workplaces to empower individuals to realize their whole potential. So John's career has taken him from Silicon Valley startups to the New York Stock Exchange and ASX-100 listed companies. So John publishes in academic and media publications and regularly speaks at national and international conferences. And as I've mentioned, he is the co-author and co-researcher with my dear co-host and co-director at Human Leaders, Sally Clark, who I'll hand over to now to do a bit of an introduction of herself and then also start driving us through this mastermind. So welcome, John, and welcome, Sal. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Alexis. It's great to be here, and it's really exciting to share this sort of live space with everyone here, and especially with you, John. So my name is Sally Clark. I am co-director at Human Leaders. I'm a former finance lawyer who had a burnout 12 years ago, and I've shifted into coaching as well as speaking and authoring 2 books on burnout. And my mission is to really create a workplace where the word burnout becomes redundant because we're embedding well-being as part of who we are and how we work. So to get us started, I'm just going to set the scene a little bit by sharing the World Health Organization definition of burnout, because we do tend to use the word burnout quite a bit, whether I'm, burnt out on tacos or I'm burnt out on, it's entered the sort of general vernacular. So just being really specific about what we mean when we say burnout. So in 2019, the World Health Organization defined burnout as a syndrome caused by chronic workplace stress that hasn't been managed. And it has 3 dimensions. So exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced professional efficacy. So when we're measuring burnout, and in the study that John and I have just conducted, we measure people on these 3 dimensions to ensure that they are showing each of them present to show that they have burnout. Just to zoom a little bit as well. So the cause of burnout is identified as being chronic workplace stress. We all very much know what stress is, I'm sure. Chronic stress is low-level, ongoing stress. So it can actually be quite insidious and difficult to identify. And workplace means that the World Health Organization is really placing burnout in the occupational context. And while we can experience chronic stress in different facets of our lives, one of the reasons I think this has been done very consciously is to make the conversation around the term burnout focused on our work lives, so that we can really start to address some of those causes of the chronic stress to which we are exposed in our work lives, and hopefully look to eradicate them. And that's a little bit about sort of part of our conversation this evening, to think about what are some strategies, what are some techniques or tools we might be able to use to really look at rooting out those root causes of chronic workplace stress. So, John, I'm going to hand to you, if I may, to just if you'd kindly share some of the key findings that we've just had from the 2022 study, and particularly the ones that stood out to you personally.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me to this discussion. So, as I kind of mentioned, this is our third year doing this longitudinal study, and some of the key trends that we're kind of seeing, some were kind of expected, and there's a couple that I'll mention that was quite interesting as the kind of new insights that we haven't seen before. In terms of the ones that we've been seeing, the trends that we've been seeing, the first thing is that the rate of burnout is continuing to climb. So last year, or in the first year, we saw about 29% of our participants who were using those WHO dimensions were on the sort of burnout kind of level. Last year, it jumped to about 34.7%, and this year it's up to 38% for the percentage of people who are experiencing burnout. So that steady rate of around 5-ish%, it's been quite steady in the last couple of years. Once again, we saw that women were much more likely to be experiencing burnout than men. And it's sort of an interesting point. We were asking, when we kind of asked participants to identify their gender, we did have a non-binary third gender. And interestingly, that those who identify as non-binary third gender had a really high rate of burnout, even higher than those who identify as male or female. The population is a little bit small for that one, but it's something to really keep an eye on. Now, one of the interesting trends that we're seeing is when it comes to age. So in the last couple of years, the age where you're most likely to burn out, or the participants show the highest levels of burnout, was around that 35 to 45 kind of age group. So those who are sort of in the middle of their careers, and sort of those sort of manager type of levels. But this year, for the first time, it's dropped to the 18 to 24 year age group. And so what we're seeing is burnout's being experienced at a younger stage for this for the working population, and that has some significance in terms of, we know what happens to people who are burned out if they're experiencing it at such an early stage within their career. We're going to have more difficulties within the workforce moving forward.
It's a fascinating finding, isn't it, John? And I think that's something that's it's quite striking, because we had seen the earlier 2 years sort of consistently around middle manager sort of role level, and also the age being sort of further deeper into the career. So it's and it was quite, if I recall, it was quite a sharp jump as well. This was quite a significant increase in burnout in that age group.
Yeah, that's right. So for the last couple of years, they were quite low. They were sort of in the teens in terms of the level of burnout. But this year, it's up to 45%. 47% in terms of the person. Almost half of the population within our sample in that age group are, feeling the effects of burnout.
I'm curious. Yeah, I'm curious actually, before we sort of shift into looking at some of the causes that we've identified around burnout, and then opening discussion to perhaps some solutions that we might be able to look at. I'm curious if anyone here has any ideas or thoughts as to why that might be. Why might we be seeing this huge jump in rates of burnout amongst the 18 to 24 age group? You see in the chat, someone's mentioned, do you think the younger age correlates to Zoom meetings and COVID?
I think maybe indirect, actually as a direct cause of that, which is I think the hybrid work situation does have a lot to do with it. From what, just kind of talking to people within this age group, it's kind of makes me feel quite old talking to people. But they, when they are first joining the organization, for most of us, we went to the office, there was this big thing, we met everybody, we did the, meet everybody in your team kind of thing, and went out for coffee and talked to your manager, all of that in person. But for the last couple of years, and most, especially young people who are joining a new organization, they've had to do everything remotely. And as we know about the importance of sort of relationships as a sort of protector against burnout, I think this really, you're right. I think there's definitely something there about that.
Mm. And someone else mentioned that perhaps the financial pressures that people are facing, and particularly young people are facing right now, may be contributing to that level of burnout. Would you think that would be a relevant factor too?
Yeah, this is another result. One of the things that we did in this year's study was ask, because we were really interested in terms of attraction and retention of employees. Most organizations are having this issue right now, retaining their people and also trying to attract new talent as well. And so in this year's study, we asked the participants in the study, what is keeping you within the organization and what might attract you to a new organization? When it comes to attracting you to a new organization, and this is, I think, really interesting as well, because across every demographic, age, gender, where you were working, everything, improve compensation, so getting more pay was the #1 reason that would attract them to go somewhere else.
Wow.
Now, this is quite contrary to a lot of research that has been done probably for the last decade, where money, it does play a part, but it's generally not, even in the top 5 in terms of why somebody leaves an organization. But right now, I think, sorry, I don't know who had that comment, but with sort of the really high inflation that everyone's experiencing and the stagnant wages from the last couple of years because of COVID, I think it's putting a lot of pressure on the younger employees who may not have as much, or is probably struggling a bit harder than others.
It's a really interesting shift, isn't it? Because I think I recall a study, I think it may have been Deloitte, for about a year ago, where I think money was even listed outside of the top 10 of things that people were looking for. And so it's really quite a drastic shift this year, and I imagine particularly for that younger generation. Another comment, mobile phones and notifications that young people particularly are perhaps susceptible to, and so there's no clear boundaries. It's the sense of always being connected. Do you think that's something particularly that age group, or is that something that perhaps goes beyond 18 to 24 age group?
Yeah, I think that one, it might go beyond. I think we're all a little bit guilty of that. I think, getting pinged all the time, and it's funny being in a crowded room and you hear that pinging sound. Everybody kind of looks at their phone and make sure it's not them. I think a lot of us, unless we're really conscious about making an effort to turn the phones off or put it on silent, yeah, I think we're all a little bit guilty of that.
Yeah. Another comment is it linked to anxiety and depression? Many younger people suffer stress, and I believe they set high expectations of themselves. It's kind of a little bit talking about perhaps the personal aspects that we bring to our workplace as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think for the most part, when we talk about, especially on burnout, we look at the organizational structures and the cultures that's creating this type of stressors. But having said that, and I think that is the majority of the reason, I don't think we can completely say that there isn't some personal things that a person might bring to this situation. From some of the individuals in this age group that I've talked to, there is that level of, let's say, they've never failed before, right? Like they've done great in school, they've always been the best, and they come to an organization where they're not sure who anybody is, not sure how to actually do the work. That creates that extra stress from what they were used to, and that compounded, that definitely has sort of multiplying effects on somebody.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think from my own personal experience, and also the sort of the research that we've done together, it's very much established to me that there's a lot of external causes. A lot of the root causes of burnout really are cultural and organizational. And for me, it's quite important to keep that focus on that those external causes, because I think because burnout happens to individual people, we have a tendency to get focused on, oh, well, the solution must be there, when actually, when the climate is really unhealthy, that's actually what's causing a lot of burnout. However, if I'm completely candid, I think that, I certainly had some issues stemming from childhood that would probably have made me, less likely to keep boundaries and more likely to want to, take a very high level of responsibility to my job role. So it's interesting as a researcher, I think, as well, because I really want to keep that focus on what leaders and organizations can do to change, rather than them simply expecting, individuals to be more resilient and sort of suck it up.
Yeah. One group that I've been working with, this really resonates, is in the nonprofit and kind of charity group, who actually has really high levels of burnout because they're under-resourced, and beyond under-resourced, they have this really high degree of purpose and drive and engagement with the organization, because they are, on the front lines of helping people. And it's all, they almost have the sense of they can't stop because they are helping people. And if they stop, that means somebody doesn't get help. And, I had this story from this community legal center lawyer who said, I can stop working, that one night, because I know if I stop, this person will go to jail. And if that person went to jail, things will happen in jail. So I couldn't stop working. And, these kind of things, it makes it very difficult. And because, if you tell them to stop, you actually have a different kind of problem, and they might get, have some type of moral injury, and this feelings of guilt that they didn't help this person when they could have. And so it's a very complicated issue. But I think also in that example, this is where organizations play such a big part in creating these boundaries so that they can kind of help stop people from overextending themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if legit leaders are able to legitimize taking a break and really, explicitly say, this is in your best interest, I understand the situation, but I am going to send you home now because you really need to rest. That also then, sort of seeds that idea in our own minds that, yeah, rest is important. And that absolutely comes from leaders and that sort of organizational support component. So if it's okay, I was just going to run through briefly so we've identified sort of 5 aspects of organizational factors that contribute to burnout. So before we shift into them, maybe talking about what some things might be that leaders can do to address these. So the first is unmanageable workload. So this can look very different from one person to the next. It might be really long hours. It might be too many meetings or administrative tasks, a lack of guidance on complex or unfamiliar tasks. And when work feels really burdensome and endless, even high-performing people can shift from engaged to hopeless. And this can happen, I think, in the context of burnout. It can happen quite sort of insidiously over a period of time, which can make it quite difficult for others or even the person themselves to recognize. Another component that we identified was a lack of organizational support. So this really speaks to not having, part of it is really having a sense of psychological safety in the workplace, to be able to be our true selves, to bring ourselves to work, and to be honest about the things that we're experiencing and going through. So that absence of psychological safety, which the data actually in our study also found that the lack of psychological safety does correlate highly to burnout, and presence of psychological safety correlates strongly with a sense of engagement. So when we see that at sort of that sense of feeling, disengaged and lack of belonging within the organization, that can certainly lead to a situation where burnout is more likely to arise. Another one we identified was a values misalignment. And that's where people are really craving that sense of purpose in their work and in their lives more broadly. And when there's a misalignment between sort of who we are and what matters to us and how we spend our days and hours and minutes, of work, many, many hours of our lives, then that can give rise to burnout as well. And that is also something that organizations and leaders can do, I think, quite a lot to rectify. Another is unfair or inequitable treatment. And that can be, very quite subtle ways, whether it's just not being picked on a particular project for whatever reason, it might be bias, favoritism, and mistreatment through to bullying and abuse. So in contrast, I think when people feel they're being treated fairly and they feel respected, they form stronger and more collaborative, more productive relationships and are more productive at work. And when they're not, burnout can easily take root. And as a coach, I work with a number of clients actually at the moment, coincidentally, who have been through that kind of situation, and that is absolutely a key cause of their burnout experience. And the other one that we identified was toxic leadership behaviour. So it kind of goes without saying that leaders have a huge influence over how their organisation operates and its culture. So when we see leaders clinging to outdated modalities of work, role modelling unhealthy behaviours, when they're hypocritical, perhaps they're saying, hey, everyone, take rest, don't check your emails on weekends, but then still emailing you on the weekend or insisting on a response, by 9 a.m. Monday. So this inconsistencies and really focusing on also in sort of decision making really led by, okay, how can we cut costs? How can we cut costs right now? Which can often also lead then. So for example, if a team is downsized from 10 to 7 people, the 7 people having to pick up the work of 10 people can very obviously lead to a situation where they have an unmanageable workload and therefore will be more susceptible to burnout. So those are sort of the 5 areas. That's a very quick run through of some fairly big root causes that burnout can stem from. So I'm curious, and feel free to add anything that you think is pertinent, John, but I'd love to sort of open a discussion here around, given this context where we are in 2022 with these external factors, including, macroeconomic factors that we're grappling with, and as well as these then, organizational and team issues that we face, what might be some things that leaders can do to start to address burnout in their teams? If we start with sort of the team context, what ideas might be coming up for anyone here, or if John, if you have any thoughts sort of immediately, but I'd be curious to hear what people were thinking. Feel free to put it in the chat, or unmute yourself if you feel comfortable and share anything that's kind of coming up for you as a key insight or possible approach that leaders might take.
Or maybe something that your leader, your manager has done for you that you're like, oh, that really helped.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's always great to have examples of when it's done right.
I think one of the key ones for us, Sel, and you and I have been, I guess, we've been on the experiencing end of this, and really drives our work at Human Leaders, and that is really recognizing the human in individuals and actually taking time to get to know their struggles and their stresses and the things that actually impact their capacity in the workplace, and sort of treating each individual as just that, their own sort of human being versus sort of a commodity in the bigger picture of the organization.
Yeah, I think that really resonates for me. It's obviously through my lived experience of working with you. I think that's sort of a fundamental component of human leadership as well, is really seeing that as much as historically, humans have been viewed as capital or as resources, sort of starting to see that we are actually human beings, and we need to be treating ourselves and each other as such. And in the chat, someone's mentioned, as a leader, I always look for an environment where people can speak out and suggest improvements, knowing that the leader will consider it with respect. I think that's a great observation. I think it's something where, sort of speaks to an environment of psychological safety. This can be, it's something that takes, I think, quite some some effort and some time on the part of a leader to really foster an environment of psychological safety. It's not a switch that we flick and everyone, you know, immediately feels a sense of trust and respect and dignity and safety to be themselves. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts, particularly as to what might be you know, if we're going to create that environment, what some steps might be to do so. What would be a good starting point there? I think it's also one where we, like, a lot of people, and certainly myself, have you know, a lot of lived experience of the opposite. So it's great to think about how we can sort of actually foster that. Yeah, another comment. I feel that leaders should support a culture of mutual respect, and psychological safety is essential to the core. I totally agree. I think that's in speaking from my own experience as a lawyer back in the day, that we were almost pitted against each other. I think there was actually an active, you know, intentional or otherwise, willingness to sort of create a culture of, you know, lacking in psychological safety in order to try and draw out that sort of scarcity, you know, notion, so that people would work harder and almost pitted against each other for promotions or for bonuses. Another comment, actually asking questions and listening rather than assuming we know how our employees are. What's your thoughts on that, John?
I think that's a really good one, because I think a lot of times leaders, when they become managers or leaders, they have that subject. Oh, I need to know everything. I need to you know, be the person that just have all the answers for everybody. And sometimes it's not intentional, but there's this habit for a lot of managers to want to do things to, you know, to their people rather than with their people. And so exactly to kind of that comment, asking and be the person who, you know, it's okay for you to kind of express that, hey, I don't know the answer to this. Let's work this out together. That's something we actually saw a lot of that during COVID, as in terms of leadership traits that was really successful during COVID. What we traditionally thought was good leadership traits prior to COVID, like being quite direct, loud, and, you know, just all of those type of traits, actually did terrible during COVID, because there wasn't a playbook for them to kind of go back and do. Whereas the leadership trait on things such as being a lot more, showing a lot of humility and honesty, you know, just basically asking and being open about, hey, we've never been in this situation. I don't know what to do, but let's, you know, work together to get through this. Those leaders did really well to take their organizations through COVID.
And I think what you're saying, John, is resonating for a couple of the comments that I'm seeing in the chat. One is that it does sort of contribute to that culture of mutual respect when we can admit that we don't know something. And another comment saying that to get psychological safety, the leader needs to show vulnerability and actively look to the expertise of their team members. And I think that's probably some missed opportunities sometimes when leaders do just sort of dogmatically say, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it, to miss that that you know, incredible wealth of expertise and experience that their team members are bringing. Yeah,
I think we've just been sort of programmed for so many years that, you know, what a good leader is, you know, somebody who has all the answers, they can do everything, and they are there to lead their people, you know, rather than be there to actually support their people. And yeah, that's something I think culturally the shift is happening, but we do need to make that shift.
We've had a question in the chat. Can we share some tips as to how HR can introduce psychological safety? I think a couple of the things that we've mentioned, you know, asking questions and generally listening rather than assuming we know what's going on for someone, and showing vulnerability are components of being able to create that sense of psychological safety. And I think also the transparency, which you spoke to, John, as well, about saying, hey, I don't actually know exactly what's going on here. And that vulnerability, I think, then also role models that shows to the other person this is a safe space to be vulnerable. And even though I might have a leadership title, that doesn't mean I have all the answers, and certainly not in the it's a very complex and uncertain environment that we're experiencing now. Any other ideas, and anyone will feel welcome to share as to how you think psychological safety might be sort of brought in by HR, for example?
I think this is one of those things that's probably not done by HR. I think HR can equip their leaders with the type of tools they need to, all the things that you just mentioned in terms of the communication, showing vulnerability, and creating that environment. They can equip the leaders with that, but I think it's really up to the leaders to do that for their team.
Yeah, I think that also speaks to sort of a broader point for me generally, is that I think there's often this idea that because, for example, burnout is an issue that happens to people, so then we just need to sort of, get HR on board and they need to solve things, when actually we are all humans and we're all interacting with each other in the organization, and we all have a responsibility there. Is that something that you see sort of in your work with organizations?
Yeah, definitely. One thing we've also been trying to move away from, again, that this is a HR issue, or this is a sort of a people issue, and we really frame it more as, if you're interested in innovation, or let's say innovation, it really requires a really strong psych safety, so that people will pitch ideas without the fear of, oh, somebody's going to think that's stupid, and then they're going to become stupid. Like having that space, and then also to be able to kind of fail and be open about it, saying, hey, I tried this idea, it didn't work, but this is what I learned from it. Even that conversation requires a large amount of psych safety, and that's what creates innovation. And so we've been, some of the leaders I've been working with, really trying to put it, frame it that way rather than a people issue.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it in that more sort of positive context as well. I know that's something that we're striving to do with this year's report, which will come out in a couple of weeks, is to we've known for some time that burnout is a really prominent issue, and it is growing, and we've got this data to show it. So how can we sort of, rather than moving it, maybe shifting away from burnout, how can we shift towards a more creative and innovative organizational culture? How can we shift towards a workplace where people can thrive rather than just survive? So I like that shift in framing you're mentioning there. Any other thoughts that people have in terms of sort of thinking about these cultural causes of burnout in an organization? So someone's mentioned training for leaders, and I think that's a really important component, so that leaders have the information, but also the language that they need to be able to shift things in a particular in a direction towards more psychological safety. Someone's also mentioned, I think one downfall is, even if toxic leadership is recognized, a lot of leaders just get away with it as they are important for the business. Mm-hmm. There might be some conversations or coaching, but essentially people leave under toxic leadership. I think companies have to think about how much of bad or toxic leadership can be tolerated and what to do about it. Now, I'm seeing a lot of nodding. What are your thoughts, John? Any responses to that?
I remember one of the CEOs that I worked for in the Silicon Valley. He was very big on and apologies for my language, but the no asshole rule. So he really bought into that. Even as a startup, where you've got some really important people who does the sales, and for startups, that's quite important. But he was quite adamant about it doesn't matter how important or how much revenue you bring in. If you are an asshole internally or externally, we're going to kick you out. And he was quite good about that. He kind of admitted, I am doing this role because I'm probably the biggest. I have been that really big asked for in the past. So I know how bad that is, and he sort of had the self-reflection of that. And so when he created the company, he was really adamant about creating the right culture, kind of moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you also for that comment around toxic leadership. Another comment saying that we can't reward top performers if they're also assholes that rewarding toxicity. It's rewarding that toxic behavior, isn't it? Yeah. Another comment, identifying the problem seems to me like a first step. So raising awareness on the numbers, impact, and conducting anonymous assessment for burnout and for psychological safety, so that managers have a glimpse on how persuasive that is and the urgency of the issue. And thanks for that comment too. Is that something you think, sort of getting that data at an organizational or a team level, that how do you see that sort of playing a role, John?
Yeah, I think that's really important to kind of visualize how bad it is within the organization. And I think most, especially large companies, are doing a lot of that. There's a lot more listening within, especially large organizations, in using engagement surveys, and they've all moved away from the yearly engagement to the pulse survey, so a lot more frequent kind of survey. So I think that is happening more and more. But I think the next part of that, to the person who asked the question, like, what do you do with that information? I think that is still a place that needs a lot of work. So, yep, I know my team is burning out. I don't know what to do. We've got all these deadlines we've got to hit, and they're just kind of frozen about trying to balance that out. So I think this is the part of the conversation. I think we have moved from the burnout's a problem. I think we've moved on from that. I think most people know that. Now it's really working on how do we solve this, and what are the strategies to solve that.
Yeah, and I imagine also that if we start to see whether, at team or organizational level, that these pulse checks are being done, and there's, so people are seeing that there is some level of interest in how they're doing. But if that doesn't actually translate into any change or any sort of follow-up conversation, then I can imagine that's almost hypocrisy, that for individuals in that situation would feel quite sort of like, well, you asked and I answered, why has nothing changed?
Nothing happened. Yeah, that's actually even worse when you don't do anything about it.
Yeah. Any other thoughts around sort of or examples perhaps of situations that you've seen where leaders have been able to show these behaviors and create a healthy work environment, whether it's at team or organizational level, and what exactly those behaviors were that we can maybe sort of identify and use as an example?
I think a lot of times people think this all has to come from the top down, and it needs to be a whole organizational wide initiative for some of these things, for some of the solutions. But I think where I've seen it work really well is you just need to talk to your team. They just deal with your team. For example, a manageable workload. It's quite difficult for the whole organization to talk about workload, but for your team, you can talk about that because it's generally a small team. You know exactly what everybody is doing. You can work through how do we manage the workload together, or for an individual, here's the things that's causing me a lot of stress in terms of my workload. And so start small on a lot of these things and kind of build from there. All you need is some small wins and saying, yep, hey, we tried this, it worked great. Let's try something else. And then you just build on that. There isn't a magic potion or silver bullet that I can tell you or anybody can tell you that will kind of fix this issue. And I think a tricky thing with burnout and then with other issues is that it's quite tailored to the organization and to teams as well. So what might be causing stress within one team might be different for another team. That's why it's very localized, and starting small is one of the best solutions I can recommend.
I love that, John, because I think that's also, we can, firstly, it feels quite an empowering move rather than just sort of waiting for external forces in senior leadership to shift, change the direction of the oil tanker. We can actually take some matters into our own hands and have perhaps, you know, an influence in our immediate vicinity in our teams. And it also, I imagine that can create change within an organization ultimately, because if we're seeing that one team is performing, people are happy, there's less perhaps, you know, sick leave as a result of burnout, that kind of thing, then that can also have a ripple effect.
Yeah, that's right. What you were, I think, especially senior leaders, they're generally quite competitive. And so going back to your kind of metrics and kind of measuring these things, you know, if you do have, let's go back to some engagement metrics. All of us are senior leaders in the room, and I'm getting much higher scores than everybody else. You know, I think everyone else will be like, oh, I better step up my game. Like, you know, you can use that natural competition. And this is where that metrics really matters, where you can really showcase people who are doing it really well. Because I think that's something that doesn't happen a lot where people are doing well, because it's not generally in people's metrics, you know, take care of the people and everything. But by having those metrics and then kind of showing that off, I think that will create that really good behavior, the good modeling behavior that you want.
Yeah, it could. I think showcasing is a great idea, or it could even be like, "Hey, this is going really well. Let's have a chat. Let's get together and see what's different here." And I think also bringing the focus very much to, you know, the leaders sort of taking responsibility as well, rather than just saying, "Oh, well, they must have a better team, so that's why they," you know, it's sort of pushing it back onto individuals. So really going, what can we do as leaders to improve those metrics? And I like the idea of sort of playing into that almost naturally competitive tendency. Does anyone have any other sort of ideas, thoughts that are coming to mind around steps that leaders or even individual team members might be able to make, or ideas as to how we can start to even broach the topic, start to make burnout and the focus on burnout prevention more of a priority for organizations and for leaders? And I think obviously the 2022 Global Burnout Study will be an important document for people to have, but I'm curious if there's also any other things that we might be able to do sort of right now, almost today, to start to shift the dial in work culture. I see some typing going on.
While that's happening, maybe I'll just throw out another example of something that I've used for in terms of the manageable workload. So a lot of times, managers, especially of really big teams, don't know exactly how much work everyone is doing. So there's a simple exercise that that kind of recommended for them to do. And one caveat is that you want to make sure you talk to them about why you're doing this. It is purely to kind of figure out what the workload is and to try to help the person manage it. It's not sort of micromanaging. But basically at the beginning, so this is an exercise that takes a week. At the beginning of the day, ask the person to write out the priorities for the day. So this is, you know, today I've got to do these 3 things or however many. And then at the end of the day, write down what sort of interrupted them during the day, what made them not be able to kind of do the work that they wanted to do that day. And also during the day, was there things that that could have helped them to be more efficient? For example, were there some training that that would have been nice so that they can do what they do a little bit faster? Where some red tape that would have been great to kind of get rid of? And so you just do those 3 things, write those 3 things down, do that for a week. And then at the end of the week, kind of have a chat with, so in this case, I'm the manager, have the conversation with that individual through these things and really kind of talk through, okay, so the things that's interrupted you during the day, you know, give them almost let them know that it's okay to say no. You've got things you need to do. These are just kind of interruptions that was unnecessary. It's okay to say no. It's really important for for people to know that their manager will back them when they say no, because we always have this assumption, oh, I need to say yes to everything, or my boss will be like, why didn't you say yes? When in reality, most of the time, I think managers would be like, oh, you can say no, that's not very important. And also kind of have a better understanding about what they think are priorities for that week. And I think that's a really good understanding, to share that understanding between a manager and the team member about, I thought this was what I had to do, and maybe the manager's like, oh, actually, only a couple of these you had to do. The other ones, it was like nice to do, or maybe you didn't have to do it until a couple of weeks from now. So really getting that conversation to understand workload. And what we found is there is just a lot of miscommunication about when things needs to be done and how urgent it is to get things done.
That's a fantastic example, John. I love how that really goes to the heart of creating sort of clear communication around that, because I can imagine there is an inordinate amount of time and energy spent, without those conversations fully taking place, without that clarity, and how sad almost that sense of time misspent or unnecessarily spent is for the individual and for the team. So I love that very practical tool for creating that clarity. I have some comments coming in, so I'll share. I'd say shifting from competition to collaboration culture would be a huge one. Besides the aspects you've mentioned, I have a hypothesis that perhaps young people are suffering from burnout earlier on because so many of them are more and more aware of the inequalities and unfairness in the workplace. There could probably be a mismatch between the trend of compassionate and human leadership and the reality of toxic leadership in organizations. And people are probably realizing more and more what it is, which comes at a cost.
I think that's a really good comment, because I think we have seen research from like the newer generation, like let's say Gen Z, they're just much more in touch with all of the social injustices and all of the things going on around them, much more than any other generation, who are a little bit more, it's all about me. Like this generation is very socially and about climate, about social injustice, like they're just really in touch with all of that.
Fantastic, yeah. Great comment, thank you. Another person's mentioned regular psychosocial safety surveys and link it to leader performance. That's a direct way, I think, of creating some accountability there. Changing the reward culture to include well-being and other non-KPI related things, just being a good team player. Love that. And some more of the 3 top goals of the day week is great to address workload. Adding blocks of focused or uninterrupted work throughout the day can be really effective. And prioritizing breaks and disconnection during the day, weekends, and holidays is another one. And I think all 3 of those really resonate for me. So thanks again for sharing those. I think also something that we also need to be aware of is it's important to build in time actually in our work day as part of those working hours for what we would consider more restful work. So we can have some stressful moments, but allowing ourselves also to engage our parasympathetic nervous system during the workday, so that is something that doesn't just happen when I go for my lunch break in the evening or on vacations or on the weekends, so that we're actually creating a healthy sort of sustainable work environment of itself, without relying on the free time that we're not getting paid for. It simply is a kind of a space to recover from an exhausting work environment.
Yeah, so I like to build on that. I think that's a really good point. And also, Nick, something that you had mentioned before we kind of get started, about feeling like, oh, you might be wasting time because you went out for a walk, when that really energizes you for a day. I think that's something that we really have to rethink, and we kind of reset our minds. And it's not a waste of time, because it improves your performance and it continues your performance later. There's a lot of talk about the workplace, when people are going to the office and they're like, oh, I didn't get anything done today because I was chatting with everybody. I went to grab a couple of coffees with people and catching up. So I didn't really work today. But in reality, that is what you should be doing when you're together in the office. You should not be on a Zoom meeting all day when you go to the office. You should be catching up with people, and that should be considered kind of work. That is the work you do in the office. Building that social capital with each other, reconnecting with people. That's really important, so that all of the other, when you're actually doing work, it's a lot easier. And that's something I think leaders and also organizations really need to rethink as they try to bring people back in the office. Like, it's not just coming back to the office, doing the same thing, being on Zoom all day. Like, that's gotta change.
Absolutely. I love that. I think that's such an important component of it as well. And really, I think that sort of, to me, connects with our sort of obsessive and very narrow definition of productivity that we see. If I haven't, for a lawyer, had this many billable hours, or if I haven't had, ticked off everything on my to-do list, really, and this also speaks to that 15-minute walk, or that conversation, catching up with or connecting with a new colleague, whatever it is, that in itself is actually incredibly foundational to how we work and our capacity to work well and to collaborate well. And I think leaders who can really put that focus on, hey, how you're thinking about productivity is maybe not exactly how we need to think about it, could be a really interesting direction to take conversation in. A couple more comments. Very true. Interesting. We pay for our stress in our own time, although it's created at work. And another, the struggle is organizations don't want to prioritize where they can't measure tangible outputs. That's going to be absolutely a huge barrier that's faced. And I think particularly in organizations where there really is some very sort of, I'm thinking of large organizations where there's very broad, very long-standing frameworks about how we measure our output, the KPIs that we use. So it will take some quite courageous shifts at that level. But I wonder if it is something perhaps even, as you were speaking to earlier, John, just at a team level, one-on-one even, how we interact with each other and how we talk to each other about how we spend our time and our energy at work could be a scope to start to shift the needle.
Yeah, I think this is a conversation that's really important, but I haven't heard too many organizations talking about this. Like, I think we're still measuring performance like we were in the Industrial Revolution, where how many pieces of code can you create in an hour. We're still doing that, but especially for the people who are sort of knowledge workers, that's just not how performance is measured. It's not just quantity, but it's quality and the way that you need, which to do really good work, which is having rest, collaborating with people, having time to learn. All of those things just is not well incorporated in how we think about performance today. Yeah, there were some talks when we were talking about the future of work, but I haven't heard anything in a while. So that's hopefully they'll pick back up again.
And it'll be interesting to see, I think, in the coming sort of 6 to 12 months, as we are experiencing some, strong sort of financial pressures through the economic situation globally, that how are we going to be able to navigate still holding space for conversations like this without just simply slipping back into historical patterns of focusing on how many shoes did you produce, or how many nails did you tap in? And really being able to continue to hold space for a broader and more holistic conversation around performance. Awesome. I'm aware of the time. I'm just going to throw open if anyone has any sort of final thoughts or comments or insights they'd like to share. I'm really grateful to everyone's very present participation in this discussion. It's been really wonderful and enlightening for me, really encouraging, I think, actually, too, in the context of the burnout research. So thank you. Thank you so much for that feedback. Yeah, lovely. And yes, we will share as soon as the report is available. That will be widely distributed through human leaders channels, obviously, through myself and John as well. Feel welcome to reach out if you have any specific questions. Thanks everyone for the feedback, and thank you so much, John. Thank you for being here. And I feel like we could probably, in fact, everyone who's here, we could continue talking about burnout till the proverbial cows come home. But we'll leave it here. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thanks, Al. Thanks, everybody.